Everybody, this is Rich Gehrman, if you can't see me, and welcome to our webinar today. We have two guests and we have people who are signing in as we speak, so people will be popping on here. So I want Stephanie, can you figure out who that might be and see if you can encourage them to mute? So I want to introduce our guests, and I want to give you a little background on today's webinar. And tell you about what's coming up next time and make that as brief as possible so we can hear the presentation from Michelle Chalmers and April Grissom. Both of them are consultants that have been basically facilitating the process of developing child foster care licensing guidelines or updating the guidelines based on some legislation that got passed 2 years ago. I just want to say a lot of facilitated discussions, and they've done a great job. It's not a particular talent of mine, so I'm always a little overawed anyway that somebody could actually run a meeting like that. But they've done a fabulous job. They've included a lot of people. I'm sure they'll tell you about that. Made everybody feel comfortable. Got a lot of great input. So you probably all read their bios, but just briefly, Michelle. Is her background. I know her best as the co-founder and executive director of Ampersand Families, which, and correct me if I miss any of this, Michelle, but it was a private agency that really focused on permanency for older youth. And that's close to my heart because, as some of you know, I started out in the field doing street work and working with kids who ran away and were on the street. So I kind of have a feel for that end of the business. And it's just been a very strong advocate for kids who are aging out of foster care, was in the foster care system herself, and was a foster parent. So she's, got a lot of lived experience that kind of, plays into this. And April is also the second part of this team. And she was a culturally specific foster care licensing person for many years, working on ICWA family licensing, and is also a licensed social worker. And I don't know April as long as Michelle, so I don't know as much background, but I'll let you fill in, April. But both of you run a great process. So just a little background. Some of you know this, so I apologize for repeating. But Safe Passage for Children was involved with several of our, I call them trusted advisors, some of our senior kind of people who volunteer and have background in courts and so forth, and the Institute to Transform Child Welfare at Mitchell Hamlin, a couple other groups, to basically lower barriers to becoming a foster parent, particularly legal barriers of having had a felony in the past or other involvement with legal issues. So that a lot more parents, particularly BIPOC parents, would qualify to be foster parents. So the guidelines are kind of part of that whole deal, because what we agreed to in this was that guidelines would be developed that instead of having kind of rigid disqualifiers that people couldn't overcome, there would be more ability to make judgments about people's current ability to be foster parents and to provide a nurturing and supportive environment for kids. More qualitative judgment, less, all or nothing type of things. So that's the background of this. And what came out of that legislation was to this process that Michelle and April ran. So I'll let them start in a minute, but I just want to tell you, and I might repeat it at the end, our next session is going to be, I think it's March 29th. As you know, we've gone from every 2 weeks to once a month. And it's going to be David Piper, a recently retired family court judge, who's going to talk about how family court is involved in the child protection process. And it's kind of mysterious. Juvenile court, juvenile court is involved in the child protection process. It's a mysterious area to a lot of people, and the distinctions, I was thinking, distinctions between family and juvenile court are not always clear to people. So he's going to clarify some of those things, and we'll be happy to have him. And then for our one after that, we are going to hear from the police commander in St. Paul, who has worked with child protection as well, talking about the interface between law enforcement and child protection. So those are the next couple ones coming up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michelle and April, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this presentation today.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. April is gonna be in charge of the PowerPoint. We're gonna start with, we've got a handful of slides, kind of 2 handfuls that we want to go through just to give you some background on this project. And then we'll have lots and lots of times for discussion and conversation. And I put a note in the chat, if you're inclined, I know lots of you, but I don't know everybody. And if you'd be willing to just put who you are and where you come from in the chat, that might be no pressure, but it might be good for folks to see that. All right, so Rich told you where you are, but if you don't know, you're at the presentation around the process that's in place right now, or happening right now, to develop child foster care licensing guidelines. If you are concerned that those guidelines are already written and that you missed it or weren't told, that is not the case. We're in the process of drafting them right now. So hopefully you're not concerned or worried that you're not going to see the finished thing yet, because the finished thing doesn't exist yet. All right, let's keep going here. All right, so the work that April and I are doing, we are both temporary employees at DHS, brought in specifically to do this project. And in 2021, the legislature added a clause to statutes 260C 215 subdivision 4, which is the section on duties of the commissioner. And the section they added was that DHS needed to establish child foster care licensing guidelines, and that those guidelines shall be considered directives of the commissioner. So this work is being done at the direction of the legislature. Why is it happening now? Obviously, because the legislature said do it. But that has coincided, as Rich said at the beginning, there were significant changes went into effect July 1st of last year to 245C .15, which is the background study statutes. So some significant changes that Rich outlined earlier that basically pretty significantly reduced the number of bars to foster care and brought them in alignment closer to the Adam Walsh standards, which has been the federal standard for adoption. It's not exactly the same, but it's come much closer, and basically eliminated a whole bunch of things that had previously been barriers to providing foster care that were unrelated to child safety and well-being, and were disproportionately impacting relatives who were trying to come forward to provide care for a grandkid or a niece or a nephew. So those 2 things. The third is just ongoing concerns about, wanting to do whatever we can to secure child safety and well-being for children who are in foster care, and thinking that, we could do some things in guidelines that might enhance that. And then the ongoing commitment of this state, which is a really actual wonderful thing. Minnesota clearly has a commitment to serving relatives and kin and serving them well when they step forward to care for a relative child. And the issue kind of goes into the next bullet here, is that while we have a commitment statewide, we have not been entirely consistent in how that is playing out across agencies statewide. And I guess this is a good time to put just a little caveat here. So these child foster care licensing guidelines will apply to counties, private agencies, and to tribes who are licensed by DHS to provide these services. At this point, that's only Fond du Lac Social Services. So they will not apply to tribally licensed foster homes. All right. So as part of the directive to DHS to do this work, the legislature was also very clear that in order to do it well, DHS needed to involve a whole bunch of different stakeholders. You can see here, that's actually the text from what the directive was from the legislature about who needed to be involved. And April and I have stuck pretty true to that. And so, well, as we go on, you'll see in some slides coming up of what's been done to date, you'll see sort of who's been involved. Oh, well, there it is. Okay, so what's been done so far? Tons and tons of conversations with tons and tons of different people. But first, actually, let me put in the chat. First is an engagement website. If you have not been to that, I just put the link in the chat. It's a really slick website that you can see the notes from each of our, or not the notes, summaries from each of our work groups, a bunch of relevant or related documents, upcoming plans, summaries of the work done to date. There's a section there that has some survey questions, and we've had probably 25 people, mostly people who are former foster kids, which has been kind of neat, respond to those surveys, and it comes directly to us. It's got a place where people can pose questions. So it's a pretty slick website. In April, hopefully the beginning of April, we are going to close down the current survey, and we will start posting some of the draft guidelines and provide an opportunity on there. We'll replace the current survey with a new one, allowing people to submit feedback about drafts of the actual guidelines as we're working on them. So that website is up. People have been following the work and responding to us on that. We did a large survey to people who perform licensing functions, so both licensors and supervisors. We got 114 surveys back, 1,132 surveys received from foster parents, both relatives and non-relatives, and going through and making meaning of all of those items, or both of those surveys, and really trying to learn what folks think about. I mean, they were queried on all kinds of topics that we believe are things that are going to end up in the guidelines. All right. So we have also done focus groups with youth who have been in care. We've done 3 focus groups with relative and non-relative foster parents. We have had 6 work group meetings, which some of you who are here today have participated in that, one of which is Rich Gehrman, I think has been at every one of them. But with participation, we had a wide range of folks, and these are basically professionals. So licensors, supervisors, and community advocates. We've had folks from Guardians Ad Litem. We've had folks from the ombuds offices and community-based agencies. And well, yeah, we'll just keep going there. What else has been done? We've also sought, we've had conversations with and sought guidance from several of the equity-related teams within DHS, the Cultural and Ethnic Communities Leadership Council, which serves a consulting function with Department of Human Services on policy. We're scheduled to meet with the ICWA Advisory Group. We've talked with Child Welfare Training Academy quite a bit, and then regular meetings. Licensors and supervisors meet regularly with DHS licensing. We've sat in on several of those since we came aboard in July. And then several community advocacy groups. We've had just individual conversations with them. Okay. I think April is now going to take some time to go through the topics that we are pretty sure are somehow going to be addressed.
Yes. Michelle, you can take a break. Yeah, so the next couple slides, and there are several of them, are going to kind of outline, topic areas that we identified very early on in our work that are likely going to be addressed in the guidelines. And so these are not listed in order of importance. I think we listed them alphabetically. So just note that this does not reflect, chronicle, this is not how the guidelines are going to look based on these themes. These are just kind of topics listed alphabetically. So, first one, background studies, like we talked about, this being the second part of the child welfare reform and the background study reform being the first phase. We will, thinking about including guidance on, things like who's required to complete a background study. And then using that new non-disqualifying assessment to look at those things that are no longer disqualifications, but, to ensure that they don't impact child safety. Another area, complaints, allegations, and investigations, providing expectations when collaboration needs to happen between both child protection and licensing. And then also standards for addressing licensing concerns when, they don't meet the level of a child protection issue. It's the first two areas. Next, we have, relatives, thinking about how we engage relatives in the licensing process, and especially during an emergency placement, but really overall, making sure that relatives have equitable access and support throughout the entire licensing process, making sure children are safely cared for and, remaining connected to their relatives, kin, community, and culture. General licensing topics, a lot of areas that we just kind of weren't sure that didn't fit into other areas, so we called them general, but things like confusion over when if you're considered an applicant or a household member, so really looking at who has that parenting role, using our specific licensing documents to make sure foster parents understand their role, and when to use DH licensing or other units for consultations when those are needed. Or talking about other areas such as conflict of interest between agencies. Next one talks about home safety, thinking about physical safety concerns within that home environment, using the home safety checklist as a tool, and then also looking at our best practices related to that. So often clarity is needed around a lot of different things related to home safety, but, especially things around triggers for fire marshal inspections, or a lot of questions around, firearms, water safety, smoke-free environments, things like that. As far as home study assessments, we've talked a lot about the need for those assessments to be meaningful, and really explore the applicant's capacity to identify for the workers to identify, and then a self-assessment process for the applicant to identify their strengths and needs, and what supports they, that may need. And then also challenging, how do you have those challenging conversations when talking with applicants about their personal history or those tough things you have to talk about. And really wanting to make sure that when we do these meaningful home study assessments, they're used for placement decisions. Getting through there's a few more slides here. Information sharing is another big area that we've talked about. And it's, a really critical area to get, to make sure the foster parents get the necessary information they need. And also helps to, take into consideration if the child entering the home, what needs to be considered if there's already children placed in the home. That importance of that ongoing information, even after the child is placed, to be exchanged, or when new information is learned, and considering all those, different things when you have to make those tough decisions about, safety or separating siblings. We will likely address licensing actions, helping determine or helping, provide guidance around when a licensing action should be recommended, or maybe you need to consult triage first. And again, wrapping that around those difficult conversations that you have to have with applicants or license holders when there is ongoing issues or concerns that might result in a licensing recommendation. Couple more slides here. Minimum standards for licensing, thinking about that, meeting minimum standards in the rule and statutes meets the minimum standards to receive a license. And so it's important for agencies to be clear with applicants that they might require something additional beyond those minimum standards that might be required prior to a placement, not just the license. And so guidance for agencies on how to navigate those requirements that do exceed rule or statute. And then we have ongoing support of licensed foster homes, using our tools as far as like the initial assessment, and then our updates and our annual reviews, our regular visits and ongoing communication to make sure we're assessing ongoing support needs, and then that we follow up with that training and support needs that we identify. Also ensuring that providers are informing their workers and agencies who's living in the home or any changes that occur in their home that could impact child safety and well-being. Almost done here. I think there's 2 more slides. Quality of care. So again, we want to see quality of care that, provides the same standards across the state. And so some of those areas that we've identified are racial and cultural identity needs, providing, guidance around competence regarding sexual orientation and gender, communication around, family and sibling contact when it's appropriate or not appropriate to use a safety plan, making sure there's access to mental and physical health care and medications. Lots of thoughts about kids not getting access to that. And then, making sure they get to keep their personal possessions, which is important in their ongoing needs. We have an area around respite, babysitting, substitute care or alternate care, really wanting to provide consistent guidelines when that alternate care is needed, but also making sure, again, that information is shared to ensure safety and supervision needs are met when those situations occur. And I think this is my last slide. So the last area is training. And so training for, in 2 different ways, training for licensors who are, again, doing those meaningful home study assessments. And then also training for foster parents. So providing, better clarification on what orientation, initial training, and ongoing training is. And then the last area is around variances. And so that, again, is, guidance around situations when a variance might be requested, but again, doesn't impact a child's safety and well-being. And so variances are requested for typically things like chemical use, capacity, or ratio. So that was a lot. And those are, again, I think, is it 14? I didn't count, but I think we came up with like 12 or 14 areas that are likely to be addressed in the guidelines. So what is coming up? Again, I think Michelle mentioned this when she was talking about the engagement page, but we will be putting summaries. We already have summaries of our work group meetings, but we will also be putting summaries of our engagement activities on our website. And we will also be sending those out to participants who participated in those activities. We are thinking and hoping to have 1 more engagement meeting with parents of kids who have been in foster care. And again, as Michelle mentioned, we are planning to post some draft guidelines on the engagement website in April. And we will, again, create a survey or encourage comments to be included in that area. We will have guidelines completed by July 2023. And then in that summer, we will also be developing and offering training on the new guidelines. Here again, Michelle posted the link, but here's again, if you want to see what it looks like, this is kind of a sample picture of our engagement page. Please also share it with those in your network who might not be in this meeting and might want to check it out. Feel free to share the link. And that's it. So I'm going to unshare and we are happy to answer any questions you might have.
We know that probably was not the most fascinating presentation you've ever seen in your life, but it felt important to tell you what has already happened, what's coming up, and what the point of this is. And, it's not that exciting. So do folks have questions about any of that content, or, thoughts you're having or concerns you're having?
My question for you two looks like a well thought out project here. I'm just wondering how the finished guidelines are going to compare. What main differences are there going to be from what the existing guidelines are?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there are no existing, actually, let me rephrase that. We have statute and rule. So statute and rule is basically, I mean, you know, when we tried to look at examples from other states, that is basically what most people refer to as their standards or their guidelines, right? So statute and rule lays this stuff out. The way I think about it, Minnesota is going one step further, and we are making some efforts to provide more guidance on the application of statute and rule to bring some better consistency, because you can't really do that in statute, right? Like you can't. So there might be some a situation that most situations actually require some thoughtful consideration, right? The answer of how to proceed isn't always really obvious. So the guidelines may give an example and say, in this situation, here are 4 things you should be thinking about, right? In order to meet this guideline, in order to make your decision regarding this guideline, here are 3 considerations you should be thinking about to help you make the determination of what to do. I don't know, so we're going one step beyond statute and rule. There isn't another document called this existing.
And what would you say is the main things that are different from the old, from the previous situation, not guidelines, but situation? What does this do that's different?
Oh, so what this does that's different than statute and rule?
Right. Then whatever the past practices are, what's this going to change for people?
So what it's going to lay out clear expectations from DHS around some of the issues that have been challenging for workers to navigate. So that we believe it's incredibly important that if a relative steps forward in, County X, that they have the pretty close to the same experience or similar experience in terms of access to the child foster care licensing process that they would have in County Y. Because at this point, it is in many ways, it is very, very inconsistent depending on what county or agency you go to, the degree to which relatives are engaged in the process and the extent to which they get a welcome, appreciative response when they're attempting to step forward. So that's just one example. I don't know, does that help a little bit, Rich? I think some of the stuff around the background study questions that the changes in July, the guidelines are going to address some of that, but there's good guidance out of licensing and around what to do with background study findings. There's a new tool that's been offered that isn't by me in April, but there's a new tool that licensing has done to really help people walk through non-disqualifying findings. So findings that come up in a background study that aren't disqualifying, nothing has changed there. You're always supposed to have looked at those and gone through them and made an assessment about whether or not those are concerning in terms of child safety. And licensing has now provided a document to help people do that, which I think gets to some of what you talked about at the beginning, Rich. Again, folks have always been doing it, but DHS now offers a more concrete. So Aaron's got a thing here, and I see a question before that I'm not skipping here. Legislation gave the guidance that licensing needs to be changed, but they do not need to approve the proposed changes once they've been determined. Nope, they do not. They do not need to be re-voted on or no. Yeah, so it's policy guidance, which DHS is empowered to do. So no, they do not need to be approved. Once they're written, they are written. That doesn't mean they won't ever change. That won't mean that we won't write something that we missed the mark, right? And so I keep referring to it as the first iteration. Mark, so why has CPS had so many injured or killed in the past? If you're referring to Rich's or to the recent report that came out, that's 7 out of 88 in Rich's report. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that and earlier ones, when this first showed up in the articles in the Star Tribune, it was just astounding that you had deaths even in foster care. And so that's what I was referring to, just over the past several years.
Well, yeah, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure what the articles that you're talking about. I mean, I know, a lot of the stuff I've seen has not been in foster care. They've been CPS involved families.
Yes.
But yeah, so there are. And so why has CPS had so many? I mean, that's kind of a hard,
just thinking about what would you be doing better than the past?
So the guidelines, so what we're trying to do with a focus on child safety and permanency, child safety and well-being, are there differences that make a difference when families are being assessed about whether or not they can be, they should be foster care providers, right? Are there things that agencies could do better in their initial assessment? I don't know that the answer is necessarily yes, but I think we want to look to strengthen that and to bring better consistency and to offer licensors, people performing licensing functions, more tools. So that's one. I think there are absolutely some things that some fall in the scope of licensing guidelines, some do not. And these things are going into a parking lot that needs to get to the right places, because we are not the answer, the be all end all. There are some things about visits, what needs to happen at a visit, but when a placing worker is visiting a home or when a licensing worker is visiting a home. I think there are some things that we should be looking at about who you need, who or what do you need to see, what constitutes a visit, when, we're doing some talking about the possibility of writing in unannounced visits and what that would look like. Again, I don't know that any of these things on their own are magic wands. I know for sure we need, and one of the things that's going to go on the guidelines is about better support for people who are providing foster care, both relatives and non. So the home study assessment process is supposed to figure out what your capacities are, what your strengths are, and areas you need support, right? Because none of us is perfect at everything. And we need to make sure that licensing agencies who are responsible for supporting foster parents are paying attention to the things that they themselves said the family needs support on, and is helping provide that support. So I think it's all of those things combined. I don't know, that's not probably a perfect answer for you, Mark.
Well, let me, Mark, if I can just answer too, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with me talking, I want to hear from others, but just to reinforce, part of the reason Safe Passage got involved is to try to, if we can't have statewide standards in a formal sense, this provides training, it provides more support for foster parents and for the licensing worker. It provides, some kind of guidelines or consistency so they have a better idea of what they're supposed to be doing. Because when you have all these 80 plus local areas, then people are kind of on their own. So I think that the things that Michelle brought out about consistency, having guidance for both the foster parents and the licensing, I think that's kind of the stuff we've been working on. And I think that this process has actually moved that forward in a significant way. So I think in some ways we've accomplished what we hoped initially, and I don't want to, again, let other people jump in, but I would like at some point here, what are the implementation challenges that you see down the road? Because that's like the other 50% of actually making this work. And, let me see if anybody else wants to jump in first, but if you wouldn't mind putting that in your parking lot and coming back to it at some point. So I hope that helps, Mark.
I think there's one other really, I think, significant thing is around training and development, and it ties to the stuff around foster parents' needs both, support needs, training it is support, that we've got to do a better job of figuring out what are the basic skills that we want foster parents to have, and how are we helping figure out, right? Skills-based assessment or something. How do we figure out what they have and what they need, and how are we going to deliver that? We want to look at some strategies for helping tighten that up.
I think one of the other issues that come in, Mark, and this is something Rich and I have talked about quite a bit, is you can have all the guidelines in the world and you can have all the best practices and policies in the world, but a lot of times it just boils down to human behavior. I remember one of the cases, because I was also involved in doing some of the reviews on the fatality report. The relative said all the right things up front about wanting to take this kinship placement, but then behind the scenes was talking about how never liked this child, never wanted this child in their home, and right away started mistreating the child. So on the one hand, the person is saying the right thing face to face to the child protection and the foster care people and the court guardian ad litem and so forth, but behind the scenes is behaving and saying something very different. And that's something that no policy or procedure or guideline can fix.
Right.
That's a human flaw in a sense.
Yeah, and Greg, I would add to that. I mean, you're completely right about that. And I would just add, this is not that thing that you're describing is not relative specific.
No, not at all.
I mean, you made reference to relatives, and I think that is not, relative foster parents are not the only people who have intentions and then don't meet them or misrepresent, right? I mean, so.
No, I was just referring to the one case study that I reviewed as part of the fatality review. And the unit that I supervised in investigations in child protection for over 20 years, we investigated all the foster homes and stuff. And the similarities between a foster home investigation and a non-foster home investigation, then the dynamics are essentially the same.
Right.
Human behavior is human behavior.
No, you're 100% spot on with that. And I think so one of the things we can do is provide some guidance to people who are assessing families right at the beginning. And again, like exactly what you're saying, Greg, people are not always going to catch every single thing, but there are some practices, there are some probing questions, there are some things that folks should be looking for in both the positive and in the detrimental, that we do not consistently train our workforce to know what to be looking for, how to do it, how to make meaning of what they're hearing from a family, and what the implications are for whether or not they should be in a licensed foster home. So thank you so much. Deb, I see that you have a question about data collection. DHS definitely has, I assume, maybe if there's a DHS, Deb, is Deb here? Oh yeah, Deb Best's question in chat. Is that stuff all on the DHS dashboard? Broken down by non-relative foster providers about length of placement, number of placement, disruptions, and all that? Nope, she may have stepped away. I think that's some of that's on DHS dashboard. It may not have all of that. Yeah. So Nicole, I see your comment that people are super overwhelmed with training. And so we've definitely heard that we have completely heard that from foster parents, both relatives and non. And I think what they were asking for was relevant training. So there's a lot of folks are talking about, give me training around the issues that have to do with the kid that I'm taking care of, particularly for relatives, right? Because the other thing that happens with relatives is sometimes folks are getting variances or varianced out of, right, some of the training, which is good, but it's also preventing them from getting prepared in the way that some non-relatives are. And so, yeah, you're nodding. So I hope it sounds like we're in.
Yes, for sure. For sure. I think it's just like they want all these things and we talk about it and they're yes, yes, yes. Show me that. Where can I get that? But the reality of having a quiet hour, even that they can log in to watch a webinar or something, is it's just like they can't take in anything else right now. They're just trying to make sure that everybody has clean socks for tomorrow. You know, I mean, that's the reality. And I want to, you know, try to support them and bolster them the best that we can. But, you know, I mean, it's tough, like short of hiring them literally live-in help or something, especially during that first month or two, you know, until the dust kind of settles and we get in a groove together and we're saying, have you done their well child checkup yet? You know, has the guardian ad litem needs to come over here and meet with you. Are you going to be home on Tuesday at this time? This person needs to see you. We need to meet with you to do the MAPC assessments. We need to, you know, I mean, it's just so much. And they're like, I can't take any more time off work. You know, like I'm maxed out. No, you can't come in the evening. We have a routine that we need to follow. These kids will be monsters if I don't have them in bed. And, you know, I mean, so it's just, yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And one of the things that we did here, and we heard it both from the youth leadership team, so the youth engagement groups, and from the foster parent communications, both in the survey and in the groups, that foster parents are being asked to do some things that teeter on maybe not actually being their responsibility. So trying to know resources for every kind of provider that a kid would need and go out and find a new clinician and things that may or may not really be their responsibility. And that's part of what is spreading, you know, figuring out what school a kid should go to and who's got the appropriate school needs. That may, again, this isn't in the scope of the guidelines, but some of that might actually be placing agencies role, not foster parents. And so,
right. And I'm lucky enough. I mean, we're a smaller county and we don't have that. We're able to, you know, our case managers can coordinate and make all those referrals and everything. But I was looking at the comments too, and it's interesting. Like I 100% agree with what Deborah is saying as well. Foster parents are asking for training. They're asking, like you said, for training to be relevant, accessible, on demand, you know, and everything, all those things. They want it. It's just, it's, you know, it's not that the want isn't there. It's the practicality and like them trying to, you know, so I agree.
Nicole, Michelle and April have the responsibility of figuring out that balance. How do we provide training, make sure it's accessible, make sure they get what they need to care for these kids? Because that's part of the issue too. If they don't know how to care for these kids, if we don't provide them the support to do that. And I'm really suggesting that we reframe the concept of training from a must to a support.
Yes,
and to reframe that completely so folks, and then make it meaningful. And I think that's a question that we're going to wrestle with for the next couple of years. How do we make training meaningful for folks and offer training that's helpful and not just something you check off on a box?
We use MNADOPT and Foster Parent College extensively with our parent foster providers, relative and non-relative, because they can, target specific relevant topics that may assist them in their current situation. I mean, like at 8 o'clock at night and Jimmy again is refusing to get in the tub or has whatever, like it could be a go-to for them, like right in that moment kind of a thing. So we use that a lot.
That's exactly actually another thing. Foster parents talked about skill-based training. You know, folks made comments like, I don't need another training telling me about what every mental health diagnosis means. I need to know what to do when X, Y, and Z are manifesting and I'm trying to help de-escalate a situation, or I'm trying to. And so we definitely have heard that. Mark, I'm not 100% sure about your comment. I know that our guidelines are only about child foster care licensing, so only referring to child foster care homes. So nothing that we're working on is related to group homes. In terms of this project, I don't know if
Well, if you don't know, then you don't know, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure what your question is all.
Well, I would just, if, if you, some group homes may be quite good in that kids get more socialization in those homes versus the home with only one or two other children in the house. It's like kids going to school. They get to see friends and be with other kids. And so some of those kids might do better in a group home situation.
Yeah, those are placement decisions. And I mean, it's pretty well established that family-based settings for most kids in most situations are the appropriate placement. But yeah, and so those are placement decisions.
Right, thank you.
Rather than licensing. Any other questions? Any other questions that we can't answer?
I was just going to comment to Mark too, if you were so moved. There's lots and lots of references if you look at rule and statute about, child placement decisions being based on the least restrictive and most family-like setting. Those are the words that you'll see over and over again. And that's based on a lot of years of studies and things.
So I just want to invite people again to just please jump in with questions or comments. Feel free to turn on your camera or not, but you're invited to do that as well.
Well, if nobody else is going to jump in,
Bring it on, Greg.
Has the idea come forward at all of having like a central set of guidelines that would apply to everybody? And then there'd be like some unique guidelines that would pertain only to certain cultural, ethnic groups? I know that concept has been floated in other areas. And I'm just wondering if this has come up with the foster care guideline area.
The only place that approximates what you're talking about is there is some potential new what's the legislation coming from the feds that's not out yet, where they are talking about the possibility of states being able to have different standards, different sets of guidelines for relatives and non-relatives. So it's not broken down by racial group, but relative versus non. Although Minnesota already allows some very non-child safety related variances with relatives. And so I don't know that what the feds are talking about will be that much dramatically different. And Minnesota already pays relative foster parents the same as non-relatives. Some states don't. So what the feds are talking about is pretty dramatic, but not so dramatic for Minnesota.
Yeah, the driving force that I've heard is coming more from different ethnic racial groups themselves, saying that certain parts of the guidelines should not pertain to them, or that they should have exemptions based on their cultural backgrounds and so forth.
If you've heard stuff that you want to send over or ask people to call us, I mean, we've been talking to a wide swath of people. We have not heard that. I mean, I'm definitely aware of all the stuff in the African American Family Preservation Act, if that's part of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Most of the discussion has been around the background study stuff and the equalization. And even that wasn't necessarily by race. That was disproportionately impacting relatives, and relatives are disproportionately people of color, because in Minnesota, foster kids are disproportionately kids of color.
And no, I've not heard anything specific to foster care licensing. It's more, I'm just extrapolating from things I've heard pertaining to child protection as a whole. And like with the push for like an African American Child Welfare Act, similar to the, ICWA and so forth. And, these different kind of splintering things that I've started to see gain momentum over the last 2 years.
So I would, again, this isn't necessarily the guidelines, but I would say most of the stuff that's actually, I think anything that's in ICWA is the gold standard for every kid. Like in terms of staying connected to relatives, kin, community, and culture, and prioritizing that, I think that in my head, that's just good practice. All right, so Nicole, revamped format for the home study and separate ones for relatives and non-relatives. Nicole, what do you think would be some of the differences in the home study assessment?
I have pondered that, but I often
Do
find
tell.
like when I'm meeting with relatives, they're frustrated. Like, my goodness, this is my niece. She's lived with me half of her life. Why do I have to, disclose my whole, you already know about what's going on in my family. Why do I need to, go in? They feel like, what is their own personal, divulging of the family history again, or things like that. I think that it feels intrusive to them. They didn't raise their hand necessarily
Right.
to
They
go,
got a phone call.
these are things that a process that they have to do to be able to keep a child within their family. You know what I mean? And so I think that, I think it's important for child safety and well-being to make sure to ask all the questions and have good conversations and develop that rapport. Not that we can always know, we can't always know, no matter how the presentation is, but, we can make our best effort. But there's a part of me that feels like we're making it harder too. And it makes it kind of unnatural. They already have not every single time, but many times they already have a natural relationship with this child. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. And doing anything with the home study assessment or document is not in the scope of this project, but that is in the scope of the very long list of important issues and because you're making me think about, again, that's not going to be in these guidelines, but something around what it looks like if somebody already knows or has parented the kid, and if they haven't. So not necessarily relative, not relative, because a lot of relatives have never had the kid in their home. And they really don't know all the stuff. But if your grandma, who the kid has lived with, 5 years of their 10, that feels like a different process, what you're describing. That's that's intriguing to me.
Well, and what if, why does grandma have to talk about how she's going to meet that child's cultural needs or continue with their traditions or things like that, when she's probably the one that was giving them to him to begin with, or,
Yeah.
I think there's some pieces of that feel like, it's just one more thing, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Although, it's all very interesting stuff, because we have kids who have two different sets of cultural traditions in their family, and half who hate the other, or who, we have, so those are really interesting. And that's no question that's going in the parking lot for sure.
And the other thing too, not to go off the rails, I know we're getting to the end of time, but I shouldn't be part of any of these work groups because I'd never shut up. But the relative search.
Yeah.
That I feel like, especially, when we have, we're working with parents who are obviously not in a good place right now in, what they have going on. They're not able to parent their kids. They probably are not going to be the most reliable source for who are the healthy family members that we should be reaching out to. A lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times those bridges are burned or are in the process. And so they're not wanting those connections, or they don't want certain people to know. I wish that we had access to systems that we could find, have access to more of that information. Like LexisNexis is good, but it's also going to give us the gal that lived across the hall from you in college, and it's just not always reliable either. So
I just put a thing in the chat. So Family Connections tool, all of those search engines are going to give you associated people because that's how they're designed. But this is a free Family Connections tool. You have a half-hour training and you have full access for free.
Oh,
It's a-
cool.
It's a great tool. Many states are using it as their
Oh.
state system.
I'll pass that on to our supervisors and relative search coordinator. Thank you.
You bet.
Mhm.
Any last? We've got 3 minutes. Hopefully everybody else hasn't just passed out. April, is there anything really important that we missed?
I can't think of anything.
Well, I would just make a wrap up comment if I may, just, based on what Nicole just said and some other comments, which is, this is really only a piece of what, of a lot of other pieces that have to come into play in order to really, make the licensing process and, vetting and support foster parents better. And I think with this legislation and this process, it's kind of a big gamble that we made, that we get some we take down, I think of it as guardrails on a curvy mountain road, and we took down the guardrails of saying certain people are disqualified. And the intent was to replace that with better kind of guidelines and things that would kind of help people get steered in the right direction. But a lot of this depends on how it's implemented and how the training goes, on whether it's responsive to what foster parents need, and just as another overwhelming thing, to sort all that out. So there's a long way to go here, and that's where my question was around what are the challenges in implementation. So now we sort of took the guardrails down, and now we're out there, and so the rest of this process really has to kind of come through. So Heidi, did you want to say anything or just share that comment? Or maybe you can just read it, Michelle or April.
Heidi appreciates how this process is going. Thank you, Heidi.
Well, and I'm glad you found the summaries, about the work groups on the page. So that's good, because good to know that people are finding them there.
Yeah, so Rich, we didn't talk about implementation. That is still trying to get figured out. And I do think that this sort of thing is a challenge in a state supervised, county administered system. Folks are not accustomed to there being a lot of things that are like, yeah, you kind of got to do it. That is not popular in this state. In any county administered state, not just here. And so we're going to have to navigate it. But I think implementation is a challenge in the way that we have things set up.
Yeah, and I think to the previous point, to the extent you can make it support rather than one more thing you have to do.
Right. Well, and it's not just about foster parents. Because this is these standards are about worker practice, and they're about what happens in foster homes. So it's both.
Yeah.
Mhm. I think we have to be careful not to just write a document that looks good and is a picture of how we would like things to be, but is not implementable. I just made that word up.
It's a good word.
Because as much as we would like to paint, I would love to be part of painting that picture, and I'd love to see it come true, but we have to be realistic too, and not make this feel like, so overwhelming or convoluted that, it doesn't actually happen.
Yeah, we need a foster care system that anybody in this room would feel comfortable putting their grandkid in. As a person who aged out of foster care, I think our foster care system needs to be designed to be a place that folks would, if they had to, put someone they love in, and not, foster kids need to be first-class citizens, not second or third. And
Absolutely.
And so it's hard. It's hard to figure out what to, where to draw that line. But I totally hear you. We can't be complete fantasy.
Maybe we'll get there, right?
Well,
yeah.
If we can't do it good enough, then we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, that's right.
And then we should let kids get hurt by people they love, not by strangers.
Yep.
I don't think we're in that situation. I think we can do this well.
I think we can.
And
I think we are.
Lots of places we are doing it well.
Becker County is awesome.
Note taken.
On that positive note, so April and Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time. Do people know where to reach you if they have follow-up questions? They reach you by way of that website, that webpage, right?
Yes,
Yes.
I also put our email in the chat here.
Yeah, do that, and I'll leave it up for a couple minutes if people want to copy that so they can reach you. But again, thank you for doing a great job on the process of getting this together. I lived through it, and it was an exceptionally good process. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate seeing you. And again, the next one, I believe it's going to be more like 5 weeks. March 29th is David Piper, the juvenile court judge, who's going to talk about how juvenile court and child protection work together. So I'll leave this open for a couple minutes. You can get those email addresses if you want, but otherwise everybody's free to go about the rest of their day, and we'll see you next month, if not sooner.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.